Yeah.
Dave's on his way over right now.
What?
Dave Chapo is on his way over. He said, let me know when Senator Grassley gets the floor.
Reid was going to ask consent that this is the limitation. Then
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, at an appropriate time, I'm going to ask for some consideration of an amendment of mine, amendment number 6. My amendment would hold the Obama administration accountable for its recent decision to release more than 2,000 undocumented immigrants from detention centers across the country in the past month. The U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement claimed they were releasing these people because it needed to reduce its average daily detention population of about 34,000 people. This is a congressionally mandated requirement. They claimed they had to reduce the detention population for budgetary reasons. Week after week, agents were tasked to release so many individuals. At first, the Department of Homeland Security claimed that it only released a few hundred people. However, last week, the Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement admitted that the administration had misled the American people by confessing that over 2,200 aliens were actually released. They continue to stand by the excuse that budget cuts were the reason for releasing these individuals. Simply blaming budget reduction as a means to turn a blind eye towards national security of the American people is a very dangerous plan, and one that calls into question the Department's preparation for sequestration, particularly when you consider that months before sequestration, the Office of Management and Budget put out an order to all departments that national security, law enforcement, safety, and health should be a top priority. So if keeping criminals off the streets of the United States shouldn't be a top priority, according to the Office of Management and Budget, I don't know what should be. And so I want an accounting for it. And that's what my amendment does, a simple accounting for why they were released, what it was all about. But what's even more disturbing is the fact that the department had billions of unobligated funds from the past 2 years that could have been put into protecting the American people. On February the 27th, I sent a request to Secretary Napolitano questioning the decisions of the department. The letter, co-signed by Chairman Goodlatte of the House Judiciary Committee, was an attempt to better understand, just simple understanding, of how the department will better confront sequestration and reduce operational challenges that could affect the life, safety, and health of the American people, the same life, health, and safety of the American people that's evidenced by this very administration's directive going out of the Office of Management and Budget of the priorities that ought to be established during sequestration. Now, you know what? So often, as what we find from this administration, and even found in previous Republican administrations, letters that are embarrassing go unanswered. Unfortunately, this is not unusual. About a dozen of my letters to the Secretary of Homeland Security on just the immigration issue have gone unanswered. There's no respect for congressional oversight. It's very frustrating. We're on the cusp of undertaking a massive reform of our immigration system, yet getting answers to the most basic questions seems to be an impossible operation. Time and again, we have seen that this administration refused to be held accountable. And what we want is just information. It's not like we're saying that what the administration's done, even if we disagree with it, can't be done, shouldn't be done, but shouldn't the people know about who's being turned out in the streets that have been held in confinement for a long period of time? I fear what will become the President's promise of transparency if and when we do pass an immigration bill is just an example of things to fear in the future. Enacting a bill is one part of the process. Implementing the law is another part of the process. If we don't have faith in this administration now, what about trust for the future? So my amendment would require the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to submit weekly reports, just submit reports to the House and Senate Committees on Appropriations and the Judiciary. The reports will be required to contain detailed budget on how ICE will maintain the 34,000 detention bed occupancy levels authorized by Congress. It also requires ICE to provide the number of aliens released from detention as well as the following information on aliens released for budget-related purposes, the conviction or charge for which they were detained, fugitive status, existing prior deportation order, and the release terms of release. My amendment happens to be co-sponsored by Inhofe, Vitter, Boozman, Roberts, Coates, McConnell, and that's the co-sponsorship. Now, within the last few days, we've had the director of ICE, Mr. Morton, testify. Well, it was just yesterday in the House. Chairman Goodlatte said his testimony raised more questions. I'll put a press release in the record that expresses this. Last week, Mr. Morton said they released 10 Level 1 offenders. These are people convicted of violent crimes. They are repeat drunk drivers, as an example. Yesterday, he said they only released 8. But he also said they were trying to relocate them and bring them back in. Well, if you got these dangerous people out on the streets, the public ought to know about it. And so I suspect that when I'm asking unanimous consent now, that the other side will object to my amendment. And I don't know why they want to go to such lengths to protect this administration when all we want is simple information, just simple information. We aren't saying that the decisions made, even though we disagree with it, ought to be changed. We're just saying the public ought to know when you've got people that are violent people out on the streets, that they shouldn't be out in the streets. We ought to know where they are, why they were put out there, and what about it. But so I say the option of not allowing this amendment to have a vote, as I presume it's going to be objected to, I think their objections are indefensible. So at this point, then, I call up for consideration my amendment number 76. Ask for just 10 minutes of debate, and I'd like to have a vote on my amendment. I ask unanimous consent to do that.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Yes, reserving the right to object.
The Majority Leader.
I understand how the senator feels. I mean, he is, over the years I've served with him, he always makes his opinion very clear. We had his amendment in the list of amendments we were going to do before with some modifications that my friend wouldn't agree to that, and I understand his feelings about this. The good news is that within the very near foreseeable future, hopefully I can start it in next work period, is we're going to start immigration legislation here on the floor. We finally are going to be able to move to something that will include issues that people want to deal with for a long time. So I say to my friend, I object, but understand how he feels about the issue.
Objection is heard. Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding cloture having been invoked, following amendments be in order to the Mikulski-Shelby substitute. Coburn 69, Coburn 93, Coburn 65 as modified, Coburn 70 as modified, Inhofe-Hagan 72 as modified, and all those, and Mikulski-Shelby as modified, Leahy as modified, and all those modifications are at the desk. And prior blunt number 82. That no other first-degree amendments to the substitute or the underlying bill be in order, and no second-degree amendments be in order to any of the amendments listed above prior to the votes, that at 2:15 p.m. all post-cloture time be considered expired, with the time until 2:15 p.m. equally divided between the two leaders of the designees, with 30 minutes under the, we'll have to make that at 2:30. I changed the time to 2:30. Well, there's
30 minutes for Republican time for Moran.
Oh, it's only 1. I thought it was 2 o'clock. I'm so sorry, Mr. President. I apologize. I was a little ahead of myself. So 2:15 is perfect. And during that time until 2:15, there will be 30 minutes of Republican time under the control of Senator Moran prior to votes in relation to the amendments in the order listed, that upon disposition of the prior blunt amendment number 82, the Durbin second-degree amendment to the Toomey amendment number 115 be withdrawn, that it be in order for the Toomey amendment to be modified with the changes that are at the desk, that the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the Toomey amendment number 115 as modified, that on disposition of the Toomey amendment, the Senate proceed to vote on the Mikulski-Shelby substitute amendments as amended, that all amendments with the exception of Mikulski-Shelby substitute be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold, that upon the disposition of the substitute amendment as amended, Senate proceed to vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the underlying bill. If cloture is invoked on H.R. 933 as amended, all post-cloture time be yielded back, and the Senate proceed to vote on passage of H.R. 933 as amended. Finally, all votes after the first vote be 10-minute votes, and that there be 2 minutes equally divided in usual form between the votes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I appreciate everyone's understanding on both sides. This is going to allow us to get to the issue at hand very soon. That's the budget, with Senators Murray and Sessions leading us in that issue. And also, we are able to get a number of these amendments that people have been really wanting to get very badly. So I appreciate everything that people have done to this point. And, Mr. President, I would note the absent quorum and ask the time be equally divided.
Without objection, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Under the unanimous consent agreement, I would now ask that the pending amendment be set aside and amendment number 69 be called up.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment numbered 69 to amendment number 26.
I ask for unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read, and I ask that that amendment be set aside and amendment number 93 be called up.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment number 93 to amendment number 26.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read and that amendment be set aside and amendment number 65 with modifications at the desk be called up.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment number 65 as modified to amendment number 26.
I ask unanimous consent that that amendment be considered as read and that the amendment be set aside and amendment number 70 as modified be called up.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment number 70 as modified to amendment number 26.
I want to comment a minute before I talk about the individual amendments. I also ask unanimous consent that that amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
On the process that we've seen, we're going to have several amendments. This is well in excess of $1 trillion in spending. We've had 4 amendments voted on, and I think unanimous consent will give us 7 or 8 more. So we're going to have a total of 12 amendments. All but the first one was tabled, was not tabled, but we're at 60-vote margins, which is fine. But for a bill that spends $1 trillion to choke down the Senate in a way that does not allow either side the appropriate opportunity to impact $1 trillion worth of spending doesn't fit with either the culture or the history of the Senate, and certainly doesn't fit with the agreement going forward and the rules changes that we had this year. On a bill that has $1 trillion worth of spending, in past history, if you look at the 104th, the 105th, the 103rd Congress, bills of that size would have 70 or 80 amendments. And we're going to choke down to 11 or 12 amendments on this. And the question is, why would we do that? Why would we limit the discussion and the division of thought manifested through votes for the American people to actually see what we're doing? And there's only really 2 reasons why this is happening. One is, and from a phone call with the President, is his own words, he wants sequester to hurt. Now, think about that for a minute. He's my friend, and I challenged him on that when he said it to me. But there's a philosophical divide in this country. The federal government over the last 10 years has grown 89%, while the average median family income has declined 5%. And the reason my colleagues want sequester to hurt and be painful is they want to rationalize that bigger government is better and that we can't afford to cut a penny out of the federal budget. And so what we do is the federal government doing less with more money while every American is doing more with less money. I would tell you that goes against the greatest tradition of our country. It also is a prescription for failure for our country when we're willing to sacrifice in the short term direct benefits to major segments of our population for a political point. Nobody's done more oversight on the federal government than I have in the last 8 years. And I will tell you conservatively, out of the discretionary budget, $250 billion a year is spent that does not positively impact this country in any way. And yet we can't get amendments up to demonstrate that. Not only can we not have an amendment up, we can't even spend the time on it to have a real debate about it. Because they really don't want to debate these issues of waste, duplication, fraud, and inefficiency. And then the second reason that we're not having amendments, or we're having amendments at 60 votes, is to cover the political cover. Our country's in so much trouble, it shouldn't matter what party you're in. What should matter is, are we fixing the long-term problems of our country in such a way as that we secure the future of our country? And what we've seen through this process of last week and this week is a focus on the short term, a focus on the politically expedient, a focus on the parochial, and from both sides of the aisle, this is not just Democrats, this is Republicans too. Senator Ayotte can't even get an amendment to eliminate spending for a missile program that's never going to be built. It is never going to be built, but we're going to spend $360 million on it next year because it's a parochial prize to a member of the Appropriations Committee. Washington is not sick because it's partisan. Washington is sick is because it's political and it's short-term in its thinking. Nobody in their right mind, no matter how much it benefits their state, would say they want to spend $380 million or $360 million, I'm not sure the exact amount of money, on a program that's never going to come into fruition unless they're thinking about them and not our country, and not the families of our country, and not the programs that have to be reformed to save them. Nobody would do that. And yet we have 60 votes on all these amendments we're going to offer because they're going to offer protection for people to vote on them to know that they won't even pass. But you can still get the cover of vote. I voted for it, but it didn't pass because it has to have 60 votes. And that's the smallest part of the problem. And to have to go through what we've gone through over the last 5-6 days and only have had 4 votes says something about this place. And I would just proffer that I bet had we had an open amendment process, we would have been finished with this bill yesterday. If everybody could have, when I came here the first 2 years, you could offer an amendment for anything at any time at a 51 vote. And so all this time we've wasted in quorum calls or on speaking on issues that have nothing to do with the bill in front of us is because we really don't want to govern. What we want to do is we don't want the body to do its work and have the input of both sides into a bill other than in the committee. What we want is a fixed outcome that will allow the administration to make sequester as painful as it can be. And so when you shut down packing plants, when the USDA says they cannot have food inspectors there, at the same time the USDA is advertising for social service workers and event planners, which if you didn't hire them could at least give you 52 people not being furloughed for a week. So what's happening to America today is we're focused inward on the politics and rather than our country. We're focused on gaming the system rather than governing. We're focused on all the wrong things because it's all about the next election. And we've got our eye so far off the ball that we now play every bill that comes to the floor has to have essentially a Rules Committee of one, which is the majority leader, deciding whether or not he wants his members to vote on a bill. That doesn't have anything to connect with the history of the Senate. This is no longer the greatest deliberative body in the world because we don't deliberate. We don't have an open amendment process. We're too afraid of our own shadows to cast a vote and think we might have to defend it. Well, if you can't defend any and every vote in this body, you don't have any business being here. And to stifle debate and to limit amendments in the way that this bill has done certainly won't breed any goodwill going forward, and certainly doesn't do the due service that American citizens are due. Mr. President, I'll now take some time to talk about the various amendments that I've called up. Amendment 69 was the first amendment I called up. And as the ranking member on Homeland Security and the ranking member on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, what we know is the Homeland Security and its grants program through what is the Urban Area Security Initiative is out of control. They haven't prioritized their funding. They haven't put metrics on their funding. They haven't controlled their funding. We put out a report in December of 2012 called Safety at Any Price, and we highlighted the problems with this particular grant program. No clear goals. DHS has not established any clear goals for how the funds should be used to improve national security. The 9/11 Commission warned against DHS spending becoming pork spending. USAI, this Urban Area Security Initiative, has become another pork barrel program providing public safety subsidies to cities like my home state, Tulsa. Third is what we found was tremendous amount of waste in these grants. The lack of clear goals has led the state and cities to use this funding on wasteful projects, including paying for overtime for employees, purchasing computers, printers, televisions, underwater robots, bearcats, all the things that don't have anything to really connect to national security and the prevention of terrorism. What this amendment does, it's prohibit $500 million allocated for the UASI grant program that have been wasted on items that do not improve Homeland Security. Specifically, it prohibits the funds from being spent on overtime, back pay, backfill pay, securities at Major League Baseball parks, spring training camps, attendance at conferences, and to purchase flat-screen TVs. The other thing we found in our report is the Department of Homeland Security doesn't know what this money was spent on. So not only do they not have goals and metrics for what the money is supposed to be spent on, they can't tell you what it was spent on because they don't actually have any record of it. We've spent $35 billion in total on all DH grant programs since 2003. We've spent $7.1 billion on this program. And what I can tell you is it has helped some communities. I don't doubt that, especially during our tough times. It has filled in. But we need, if we're ever going to get out of the problem that we're in as a country, in terms of our debt and deficits, we have to have programs that have metrics on them. They have to be followed up. The grants have to be followed, and they need to be held to account. So I hope my colleagues, I have no hopes of this passing because most of the colleagues won't actually look at the research that's been done on this, won't look at the ineffectiveness of it, won't look at the waste, and they'll vote a party line vote to defeat this amendment. We'll get 45 or 50 votes, or 51 or 52, but it'll go down. And so consequently, real problems that have been oversighted by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, really oversighted by the Department of Homeland Security, the real solutions to problems won't happen because of the way this place is being run. I'd next like to talk about Amendment 93. Amendment 93 follows a recommendation of the President. Not my recommendation, the President's recommendation. And what this amendment would do is actually take money that has been directed for expired heritage area authorizations that weren't any recommendation of the President. Actually, the President's recommendation was to cut this money in half, and we're going to do exactly that with this amendment. We're going to cut it by $8.1 million. Now, what heritage areas are, and when we started them, the 12 heritage areas that this is about are at least 16 years old, one of them 25 years old. The whole idea behind heritage areas is to fund them with a grant program to get them started and then let them run on their own with state and local funds. They've become a dependency program. And the OMB and the President's budget said we ought to eliminate the dependency of these by trimming back the amount of money. Instead of becoming temporary programs directed towards self-sufficiency, as originally intended, these national heritage areas have turned into permanent entities that continue to grow in number and funding amount. Totally opposite the original authorization's intent. In other words, they're parochial-based. As a matter of fact, one of them, the John Chafee Blackstone River National Heritage, has existed for more than 25 years. They actually thought the funding might get cut, so they created another way to pay for it, just as the government had intended for them to do. And they've raised the money for this year, but we're going to fund them anyway in this appropriation package, this omnibus appropriation package. It's not really a CR. It's an omnibus appropriation. Of these 12, 100 have already received $112 million, more than half of the total ever spent on national heritage areas. So they've been in existence at least 16 years. They should have become self-sufficient. They need to become self-sufficient, and we ought not to be spending that money. Now, what will we do with the money? That'll transfer to about $6 million, and with that money, we will turn that money into opening up the tours at the White House, opening up Yellowstone National Park and the rest of the parks. We'll be able to take, in terms of the way that money's spent out, $6 to $7 million of this money, and the national parks will open on time. And most of you haven't heard this, but in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Coding, Wyoming, the citizens of that state are raising private money to plow the snow so that Yellowstone National Park can open on time. Now, I want you to see the contrast on this. Because it's important to their livelihood and their commerce, they're going to sacrifice personally to get that park open on time. At the same time, we're going to send money to 12 national heritage areas that have been dependent on the federal government for 16 years. Tell me what's wrong with that picture. We're going to create dependency, and then we're going to indirectly tax the people of Wyoming so that one of their great areas of commerce and the visitors that come to Wyoming to see Yellowstone Park, they're going to pay for that with their own post-tax money. That can't fit with a vision of America that almost everybody else in this country believes in. It doesn't fit. Other national parks have reported campgrounds that are going to be closing, reduced maintenance. So we're going to take this $6 million and we're going to use it to help open up these parks and allow the Park Service to have the parks open on time. Instead of creating dependency in a program in the original authorization, shouldn't be getting any money now. They shouldn't have been getting any money for the last 10 years. We're going to take that money and do something for the American people. The next amendment is amendment number 65 as modified. And this is one that really gets my goat. The National Science Foundation funds lots of great scientific endeavors in this country. Matter of fact, they have about 4 times as many applications for grants as they have money to give out. But they spend a considerable amount of money doing such things as funding, quote, research in political science. In 2008, they spent $8.6 million funding research in political science, $10.9 million in 2009, $11 million in 2010, $10.8 million in 2011, and $10.1 million in 2012. What this amendment does is prohibits the National Science Foundation from wasting federal resources on political science projects and redirects that to other areas within SF that's going to give the American people a much greater return on their investment. Let me give you some examples of what they're funding. Campaigns and elections, citizen support in emerging and established democracies, bargaining processes, electoral choice, democratization, political change and regime transitions. All important things if we weren't in a budget crisis and a spending crisis. But tell me whether or not you'd rather have the next new computer chip generation developed through a grant at the National Science Foundation, or want to know how important it is to the American people the actions of a filibuster in the U.S. Senate. Which one's a greater priority? Which one's more important to the further advancement of this country? I guarantee you the former and not the latter. The years hence, we're going to be making a lot of choices about priorities. And every amendment I'm putting out here today is about priorities. Do we fund stuff that does not adequately or accurately help us in the short term in creating jobs, in being wise and prudent spenders of taxpayers' money? Or do we fund things that are low priority and let things that are high priority suffer? And that's basically what this amendment does. It says, until we get out of this pinch, we shouldn't be spending money to, for example, the $251,000 used to study Americans' attitudes towards the U.S. Senate. So we spent $250,000 last year studying Americans' attitude toward the U.S. Senate. $106,000 to study the candidate-centered elections over those dominated by political parties. $47,000 to study Americans' president's level of cooperation with Congress through their when they utilize executive orders. $28,000 to examine the prohibition movement. You know, it's been a long time since we had prohibition in this country. That has to be a priority for us. How about $250,000 to investigate how people perceive the political attitude of others? That's got to be important right now. It's got to be a priority right now for our country. $144,000 to track how politicians change their websites over time. Who cares? $144,000 will keep a whole bunch of meat inspectors at meat plants. There won't be any furloughs if we get rid of this kind of stuff. So, and I could go on. As a matter of fact, for the record, I will enter all these, what I would consider non-priority studies that the NSF has funded.
Without objection.
And would note, this is where we should be doing our work. We should be making choices for the American people. The hard choices that says this is more important than this, we don't have enough money, we're borrowing $40 million a second, and we're going to fund these kind of political studies that have no benefit except to the politicians, because they're the ones that are going to read them, and the political science professors. The average American doesn't care. But they do care on whether or not their meat's going to be safe and whether or not they're going to get meat. And you mark my words, this amendment will go down. It won't be passed because we don't have the courage to make priority choices in the U.S. Senate. And we don't have the courage to allow amendments such as this, the numbers that should have been 30 or 40 like this, on the floor to make those choices. Finally, Mr. President, I'll talk about Amendment 70. And this amendment's been modified. The appropriators have requested that the Homeland Security-related reports that are demanded in this bill, that those reports come to them. And they do appropriate for Homeland Security. But there's an authorizing committee. It happens to be the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. And what this amendment says is, you know, if you're going to give information from the administration to the appropriations, you might want to think about giving it to the actual committee that has the authority to authorize and change the programs. And I would hope that this would be accepted. We're going to get it 14 days after the appropriators. I don't know what that's all about, but I'm willing to concede. I think that Senator Carper and myself ought to see what the administration's saying to the appropriators about programs run in the Department of Homeland Security. So of all the amendments we have, I think this is the only one that has any possibility. And with that, I'd yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to address the Senate up to 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I was on the Senate floor this morning and outlined the merits of an amendment that I've tried to have pending to this continuing resolution. It's amendment number 55. It's an amendment that deals with the air traffic control tower program that the Obama administration has indicated that they will terminate this program on April the 7th. And I don't want to go over all the things I talked about this morning, but I do want to talk about how we got to the point that we are today, in which apparently this amendment is not going to be considered by the United States Senate. I indicated this morning about how, in my view, how important this amendment is. I read from an AP story from Chicago about that air safety was in jeopardy, indications that a plane crash that had occurred previously would not have occurred if there had been an air traffic control tower present. The complaint by Americans that our aviation sector is so frustrated by the political brinksmanship that goes on in Washington, D.C. Again, this is an important amendment that's about the safety and security of American people, particularly those who fly. And it is amazing to me that despite continued efforts to bring this amendment to the floor for consideration, not that I expect any guarantee, there's no such thing as a guarantee that this amendment would pass, but the inability to have it even considered is very troubling to me and very surprising to me. Last week when we started on the continuing resolution, I was pleased to hear what the majority leader said about the process on the CR. And this isn't years ago, this isn't months ago, this is just last week, in which the leader said this: there will be amendments offered, and he's talking about the continuing resolution. There will be amendments offered. We're working on a process to consider those amendments. This week, we'll be off to another opportunity for the Senate to return to regular order, an opportunity for this body to legislate through cooperation, through compromise, as we used to do. This legislation will be a test of the Senate's goodwill. We're anxious to move forward and start doing some legislating. We are going to take all amendments and try to work through them as quickly as we can. I hope we can move forward and set up votes on every one of them. Mr. President, that's the announcement that was made as we started the continuing resolution. And as the majority leader indicated, this legislation will be a test of the Senate's goodwill. Well, Mr. President, I think the Senate has clearly failed the test of goodwill, but more than goodwill, we are failing the American people in taking the steps necessary to secure their safety. This is not an amendment about me. It's not an amendment about Kansas. Certainly my home state, nothing wrong with representing your home state, is affected by the loss of these control towers. But 42 states, 43 states, almost all of us have control towers in our states, and come April the 7th, they no longer will be. And it's one of the reasons, and I've indicated this previously, one of the reasons that I thought this amendment, perhaps above others, should be considered because the control tower program will be eliminated April the 7th. I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee. I'm a member of the Subcommittee on Transportation. I will work to see that these programs are continued once we get to the regular appropriation process. The CR is behind us. But my colleagues and I will never have the chance to do that because in a matter of just a few short days, the control towers will be gone. They will be closed. The lights will be turned off. And so my role as an appropriator, my role as a member of the United States Senate, that I share with 99 other senators, the idea that we would then come back and restart a program that has disappeared, it just isn't going to happen. And so in the absence of this amendment passing, in the absence of this amendment being considered and passing, the ability for me to do my job on behalf of a program that I think matters to the American people, it disappears. And I've never tried to be a difficult member. I believe in collegiality. I believe in the goodwill that the Majority Leader talks about. But this is an amendment. I can't imagine what I was supposed to have done. It's an amendment that's germane. It's not here trying to offer an amendment that doesn't matter to the bill at hand. I'm not trying to score political points. I'm not trying to put Democrats on the line for casting a vote that the voters might object to. There's nothing here that is political or partisan in nature. I did what I thought I was supposed to do. There are 26 co-sponsors of this amendment. More than half are Democrats. They are Senator Roberts, Inhofe, Blumenthal, Blunt, Johans, Kirk, Manchin, Hagan, Klobuchar, Baucus, Tester, Enzi, Vitter, Bozeman, Pryor, Merkley, Wyden, Kane, Warner, Ayotte, Shaheen, Risch, Crapo, Murphy, Rockefeller, and Wicker. If 26 of us in that group can agree upon the value of amendment, why is it that the Senate can't even take a vote on an amendment, on a germane amendment broadly supported outside the chamber of this Senate? Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, National Business Aviation Association, National Air Transport Association, Association of Air Medical Services. They believe this is important for the ability to life watch patients. NATCA, the Air Traffic Controllers Association, the American Association of Airport Executives. This is not a provincial issue that Moran is about, something about trying to take care of himself. It's not about trying to create political difficulties for anybody. We broadly agree in a bipartisan basis that this amendment should be made in order. Now, Mr. President, I've only been in the Senate for a little more than 2 years. I served for a number of years in the House of Representatives. And one of the things that I thought was true, one of the reasons I sought the opportunity to serve in the United States Senate was it would be different than the House. Any member of the United States Senate, and we all ought to be here on behalf of every other Republican or Democrat senator on behalf of their ability to offer amendments. You know, we had a debate about changing the rules. And the suggestion was made, the proffer was made that if we would agree to change the rules, that amendments would be made in order. I thought that was a positive development. And now it seems to me, while I left the House in hopes of having the opportunity to represent my constituents as best as I knew how and to represent America as best as I know how, somebody stands in my way. I can't find out who that is. I've not talked to a senator who's not supportive of my amendment. Every conversation I have is, well, I think it's a good idea. I don't know why it's not being made in order. There is no good explanation. Who sits down and develops the list that decides which amendment is important and which one isn't? This ought to be something that's not turned over to a one-person rules committee. Again, the House and Senate are structured differently. This is a historic body with a legacy of allowing debate, discussion, and amendment. And again, not for purposes outside even the nature of the bill we're talking about. How can it be controversial to transfer $50 million in a bill that is more than $1 trillion of funding, of spending? How can it be so difficult to transfer $50 million from two accounts, unencumbered balances, a research account, to save air traffic control towers, leave them in place until I at least get the opportunity to work with my colleagues to extend their life through the appropriations and legislative process into the future? So, Mr. President, for a senator like me, I laid awake last night from, 3:15 to 4:30, trying to figure out what is it that I can say that would convince my colleagues to support this amendment or to allow whoever is making the decision that it can't be even debated and heard and voted on. And I don't know that there's any magic words. It does concern me. It bothers me greatly that we ought to all be here protecting the rights of each and every other senator. This is important to us as a legislative body, not to us and our egos as senators. It's not that we ought to have it's not that sense that we have the right to say everything and we're senators, we're important and powerful people. It's that on behalf of the American people, a person like me who represents 2.5 million Kansans ought to have the ability to bring an amendment to a bill on the United States Senate floor that is germane. Had we brought these amendments forward, had we agreed to debate and pass my amendment, we wouldn't be here today still stalled on moving forward to conclude this business and move to the budget. We could have debated the amendments and voted on the amendments that were germane days ago. But for some reason, we once again get bogged down in somebody deciding this amendment qualifies to be considered and this one doesn't. So, Mr. President, this is another example of where, again, I guess if you'd tell the story to the American people, we're going to pass today a bill that spends $1.1 trillion, and what? We've had 4 or 5 amendments offered and perhaps approved, maybe a couple of more today. This bill has not worked its way through the Appropriations Committee. It comes from the House and we immediately take it up, and it's written so perfectly that only 3 or 4 individual senators have the opportunity to alter the bill, have not the guarantee to change the bill, but the opportunity to suggest to my colleagues, would you listen to me and say, does this make sense or not, and cast a vote yes or no based upon whether what I'm saying has merit. We can't get to the point in which I've given the opportunity to explain here on the Senate why this bill, why this amendment is something that's important. So I came to the Senate from the United States House in hopes that the Senate was different, in which individual members had value unrelated to their relationship with the Speaker or the Minority Leader of the House, unrelated to my relationship with the members of the Rules Committee. I've not always been the most perfect follower of my political party. I've tried to do what I think is right, and therefore I've not always developed the relationship I needed in the House to be able to get my amendments considered on the House floor. The Rules Committee is there for a purpose. It's a very unwieldy body, the United States House of Representatives with 435 members. Here, we have 100. Surely, based upon the history, the legacy, the rules of the United States Senate, we have the ability as United States Senators, whether we're in favor or disfavor, whether our amendment meets with a person's satisfaction or not, on behalf of the American people, we have the right to represent their interests and have votes taken. And the Majority Leader said the other day that I'm an obstructionist. I laid awake last night thinking, I'm not an obstructionist, I'm following the rules. The Majority Leader said this morning that we need to show that sequestration is so damaging to the country. I didn't even vote for sequestration, and yet I can't fix a problem that's caused by somebody else's vote. Again, it is so baffling to me how this works. I finally found somebody who would tell me they oppose my amendment. Today I talked to the Secretary of Transportation, who says the administration opposes your amendment. And so maybe that's the explanation. I've asked my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, why can't I, a person who followed the rules, who did what one would think you should do to get an amendment made in order, why can't this amendment be heard? The only explanation that I guess makes sense is that there are those in Washington, D.C. who want to prove that you cannot cut spending without consequences that are dramatic. Okay, prove that point. Come to the floor, have the debate about spending, about budgets, about taxes. Have this conversation about, can we afford to cut spending? Prove to us, take the votes, demonstrate that it can't be done. But to use sequestration as the example for why we can never cut any money from any program, particularly on the amendment that I'm offering, is dangerous. What it says is we want to make a political point as compared to worrying about the lives of American people who fly. And so, Mr. President, this circumstance I find myself in, again this morning laying in bed realizing that the radicalization of Senator Moran is occurring. The only way, apparently, to get your amendments heard is to be difficult. It's not my personality, it's not my nature, but on behalf of Kansans and Americans, if what it takes is for me to become more difficult to deal with so that my amendments are considered, it's not about me personally, but so amendments that matter to my constituents and at least what I view to America can be heard, you got to make yourself a pain around here. Well, if that's what's required in the Senate, I hope that's not the case. And I hope the majority leader is right that this is the path in which we're going to get back to regular order. I want to be a member of the Appropriations Committee that works, that debates, discusses. We listen to witnesses and we figure out we can spend more money here, but we have to spend less money here. This program matters. This one is inefficient. I voted against sequestration because I don't believe across-the-board cuts are responsible. What that means is that everything deserves the same reduction. There are things that we do well and do that are appropriate for the government to be involved in, and there are things we do poorly and the government shouldn't be involved in, and yet we treat them all the same. I want to be a member of the Appropriations Committee that says we're going to evaluate each one of these programs and make decisions about spending, and we're going to choose to spend money here and not here, or the decision will be made by the Senate and the House and the President that we're going to raise revenues so that we can spend more money. But that's not a reason to block this amendment. It's not a reason to say that those people who are going to be traveling out of 179 airports that have control towers, their lives are going to be less safe and secure and run the potential of loss of life and injury as a result of us trying to prove a point that we apparently can't cut budgets around here because we want to show that there is damage to be done when that occurs. That's a very dangerous political point.
Senator, yield.
I would yield.
Yeah,